Good morning, everyone. Happy Sunday. My name is Emily Kamp. I'm the coordinator of adult faith formation here at the Church of St. Mary, and I'm delighted to see a few new faces at our Sunday sessions. Let us begin by remembering that we are, even in a history lesson, in the holy presence of God. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. When we were talking about Sunday sessions for this season, Father Stuart offered to do a couple of deep dives into Catholic history topics, and which of course made me very, very excited, not because I'm a historian, but because I know that this is what he teaches best, because he loves it. So I appreciate you guys all joining us this morning. Happy Gaudete Sunday. Rejoice always in the Inquisition.
Yes, as Emily was saying, it's like I have, of course, a deep love for church history, and so we had decided next summer we're planning on repeating the 6-part kind of broad survey of church history that I had done last year. But in the meantime, I said, it's like, well, it's kind of fun to go really in depth as opposed to sort of a broad survey going really in depth on a particular topic and getting into some of the detail. But then I found that as I was preparing sort of this talk on the Inquisition, that in fact, it's sort of, in order to contextualize it, it broadened it out, as opposed to a very specific sort of period of history, as I learned as I was preparing, that it's like actually there's a lot to sort of know about how we contextualize the period of the Inquisition, what the Inquisition actually was. Because surprisingly, we oftentimes think about it, especially as a lot of sort of the popular myths about the Inquisition, how it lives in people's imagination, is very different in some ways than the reality of what the Inquisition was. That the Inquisition actually has a much longer and varied history, and in fact we still in a sense still have the Inquisition within the church, that we call it something else now, and its functions are somewhat different, but in fact the sort of judicial process within the church is actually, there's a definite, as we'll see, there is a sort of very definite connection down to the present day, that in terms of legal and judicial processes within the church, how does that work? And the Inquisition actually gives us a lot of insight into sort of how does the church sort of deal with those questions of justice. Now, when we talk about what was the Inquisition, again, in the popular imagination, we tend to think of it in terms of the Spanish Inquisition. And we think of it, circa the year 1500, era of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, the darkest era of the Inquisition, give or take sort of 100 years or so, that this was sort of the Inquisition. But in fact, the Inquisitions existed within the church from the 10th century all the way down really to modern times. They're sort of breaking it down into sort of 3 main periods of how the Inquisition worked. It began as sort of local ecclesiastical courts. It began as something that was very much on the local level because the church and the state being very closely tied together, there were certain things that were tried within ecclesiastical courts, that the church oftentimes was seeking to promote justice within society by going through a process of using some sort of local judicial process. Regional and national tribunals also then came into existence as things, as we'll see, sort of scaled up in terms of the work of this judicial process. There would be large regional or national tribunals that would be established, which eventually would become as large as the Holy Office or the Roman Inquisition, an office that existed at the very highest level of the church at the Vatican. But it was something that sort of eventually sort of scaled up from its origins. And as we look at sort of what those origins of the Inquisition were, it's helpful, I think, to look at what the legal picture was. Because one of the things that we find is that in the 10th century, there was sort of a rediscovery of ancient Roman law. Scholars beginning to look at some of the ancient Roman texts and how did things work within the Roman Empire. So in this period in the Middle Ages, they begin reviewing the Roman legal process that had been used, which was a process of inquisition. It was a process of going in and saying, well, it's like let's gather the evidence, let's ask questions. Let's go ahead and gather together the evidence and in order to be able to reach a verdict, which replaced what had been sort of the Germanic system that had supplanted Roman law after the fall of the Roman Empire. Germanic practice oftentimes had adversarial or arbitrated contests. When we think about trial by ordeal or trial by combat, exactly how that is justice, is anybody's guess. Two people who it's like represent, the both sides and they just have at one another and whoever wins was right. Trial by combat, where exactly there is justice in that is anybody's guess. Arbitration, was simply two parties who go before a judge. That the idea of inquisition, as being a sort of evidence gathering was something that revolutionized this legal process in the Middle Ages. That the idea that, in fact, we don't simply sort of like make it anybody's guess. So within the legal tradition in Western civilization, there are really sort of two strands. And one of the reasons why I think the Inquisition sometimes looms so large in our imagination here in the United States is because of the fact that a lot of our law is based on English law, which drew some things from the process of Inquisition, but also drew heavily upon an idea of adversarial or arbitrated justice. That it's like, okay, two lawyers are going to argue the case. It's like, here are the facts, and two lawyers are going to argue about the facts, and then a judge or a jury is going to decide. And that was different from the process of Inquisition, in which the judge actually had, in which case the judge actually had enormous powers to be able to find the evidence. If you're fond of if you're fond of like British mysteries, if you love Agatha Christie or something, there's always the inquest when somebody dies, and an inquest was an inquisition. It's basically somebody who is a legal figure, a magistrate, a coroner or an official who is asking questions. Does anybody have anything to say about how this person died? Is it a suspicious death? What is the nature of it? It's an assembling of the facts. And then the coroner in an inquest has to render a verdict. It's like, was this an accidental death? Was this murder, by person or persons unknown? If you've seen British dramas, sort of the idea of inquisition is also even there still within British law. But in British law, there's also sort of trial by jury. There is an adversarial nature to it in the sense that that two lawyers are going to argue. There's going to be a prosecution and a defense. And so the idea in inquisition is there is less emphasis upon sort of just balancing it out and two parties arguing about the facts, as a judge who is given a great deal of power to be able to investigate the situation and then make a determination. All of these things have flaws, obviously, as when we think about, it's like, well, what leads to justice? What leads to fairness in a legal process? But the discovery of these ancient Roman legal texts in the 10th century began to revolutionize the way judicial processes worked. And again, church and state at this time being very much bound together in Christendom, it's like what the church was doing was very much, following what the state was doing. Instead of the very arbitrary kind of justice that had existed up to that time, the idea of having sort of an inquisitorial process to determine guilt or innocence was really an improvement. It was really something that was more fair and more just, because it was not simply you denounce somebody and you accuse them of something and then a judge is just going to decide, it's like, whether they did it or not. That the idea that there would actually be evidence that needed to be presented, that there needed to be evidence of guilt in order to reach a guilty verdict, was something that was relative. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine now, but it was something that was actually a real. It was actually something that was difficult for them to imagine in that time and place, where justice was oftentimes simply very, very arbitrary. There was not necessarily any kind of process of evidence that was involved. So what we see with sort of these early inquisitions in the Middle Ages is that there would be sort of these local church tribunals that used the process of inquisition in order to try cases, usually heresy, proper to the church. That there were certain crimes that were proper to that were sort of properly violations of ecclesiastical law, and frequently it was some form of heresy that was involved in these particular tribunals. So there was a delineation between secular and ecclesiastical courts in the administration of justice, although again, cooperation between the two very natural at the time. One does not always see that kind of cooperation. If you remember the story of St. Thomas Becket and what led to his falling out with King Henry II in Britain, if you've seen the movie Becket or know the story of St. Thomas Becket and why he was martyred by Henry II, it was because of a question over justice, because there was an English nobleman who had there was a priest who was accused of a crime, and the nobleman simply had the priest killed, and then refused to submit himself to an ecclesiastical court. But because his victim was a priest, even though the priest was probably guilty of the crime, nevertheless it was something that should have been tried in an ecclesiastical court and not a secular court. The secular court was willing to just let the nobleman get away with it, and St. Thomas Becket said no, he properly it's like this nobleman properly has to be judged by an ecclesiastical court. The crime was committed against a member of the clergy. He's violated church law, and therefore the church has a prerogative when it comes to being able to try him. Henry II did not like this because it was elevating the ecclesiastical court over a secular court. And so they had a falling out. Henry II and Thomas Becket, where their relationship went south, was over a question about the administration of justice. Thomas Becket standing up for the rights of the church, and Thomas Becket was correct according to the laws of certainly of the time. But he would eventually excommunicate the nobleman, who was a very powerful figure at the time. He excommunicated the nobleman, and so things just got worse and worse between sort of crown and church at that point in British history. So it was not that secular and ecclesiastical tribunals always cooperated with one another. Sometimes they were also fighting over jurisdiction when it came to various types of cases. Local inquisitions were usually made up of secular clergy. Secular clergy would be like me and Father Vince. Not that we have been asked to sit on tribunals, but tribunals were frequently made up of local clergy, who were oftentimes not really particularly well versed or trained in matters of law or theology. It kind of depended. However, it would usually be the local clergy that served upon a tribunal, which in some ways is the practice that we have returned to in the church. Most of the people who serve on our diocesan tribunal here in Tulsa they're all, Father Zwi, Father Mike Knipe, Father Shane Hewson. It's like they are all judges on our tribunal. And so they are responsible for reviewing cases and arriving at judgments on things. And they've all received training in canon law and so forth. And so in some ways, we've kind of reverted back to the oldest practice of local tribunals. But one of the things that the limitations of those local tribunals, one of the limitations was really when there were widespread heretical movements, which would happen with the Cathars, the Albigensians and Waldensians that existed in the 11th and 12th centuries, especially in southern France and northern Italy. It was a widespread heresy. The Albigensian heresy was essentially a kind of dualist. They had a dualist understanding that there was the good God who is in heaven, the Christian God, but then there was a bad God who is essentially Satan, who was here on earth, and that anything that was fleshly that belonged to the earthly evil God, and therefore doing things like essentially killing children was actually, you baptized them and then you sent them on their way to the good God in heaven. It was a terrible heresy, and it was very widespread at the time. And local tribunals were proving inadequate dealing on the small local level with this particular heresy, which was very widespread at the time. So ecclesiastical tribunals, first of all, began to be entrusted to members of the new mendicant religious orders, particularly the Dominicans, who were well-versed in law and theology, and also to some extent the Franciscans. Part of the reason why these two religious orders would be entrusted with the inquisitorial work was because they had freedom of movement. They could travel, from region to region. Local clergy are tied to a geographic area. Benedictines were tied to their monasteries. Franciscans and Dominicans could actually travel around in order to oversee this administration of justice within the church. And so what we see then is from these early days of the Inquisition, which were sort of local ecclesiastical tribunals, you begin to see it moving and scaling up to the idea of sort of a regional or a national Inquisition. And so again, at the end of the 12th century, we begin to see the first large regional Inquisition, and it was effective. They stamped out the Albigensian heresy. One of the things that there's a joke about St. Ignatius of Loyola and St. Dominic, that when St. Ignatius arrives in heaven, it's like he talks about all of the good works that he did trying to battle the heresies of Protestantism, and it's like St. Dominic responds, it's like, well, I battled against the Albigensians, and how many of them do you see around anymore? But the thing is, it's like, it was actually the Inquisitions in southern France were extremely effective at stamping out the heresy of the Albigensians, ending the Cathar heresy. And so the model begins to spread to other countries with papal approval. That as a system of justice, it had proved very effective at being able to sort of stamp out in order to stamp out heresy. And this led to the idea of a Grand Inquisitor. Grand Inquisitor is usually at sort of a national level, overseeing sort of the network of tribunals that existed within a various country. Part of this is to ensure that there is also a systematic process of justice. There were manuals that were created about how these tribunals were supposed to work, what they could and could not do. What we see as well then is really by the middle of the 15th century, the only two countries that do not have sort of a national inquisition are England and Castile. England, largely because they were involved in the Wars of the Roses at the time, and there was a battle over who was going to succeed to the crown, and they had other preoccupations. Castile was also sort of in the heart of the Spanish Reconquest, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so one of the things that we see is this idea of the regional and national inquisitions. There's a growing desire to sort of systematize the way this process of justice works within the church. And so most countries have some sort of have some kind of oversight over the various tribunals that exist. And now, of course, what nobody expects, the Spanish Inquisition, which should have been entirely expected because Spain was very ripe for, and this is in many ways sort of, again, in popular imagination, sort of the darkest period of the Inquisition, although the really dark part of the Spanish Inquisition was a relatively short-lived period. The background to the Spanish Inquisition: in the late 1400s, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile marry with the idea of unifying Spain and completing the Reconquest. If you had a couple of years ago a year and a half ago had done the broad survey of church history, you know that Moorish Muslims had conquered pretty much almost all of Spain and Portugal. Most of the Iberian Peninsula, around the year 1000, was was largely all under Muslim rule. Christians were a minority within the country. And so the Reconquest was the aim, began in the late Middle Ages, and the Reconquest was a long process of seeking to drive the Moors out of Spain, which, of course, Ferdinand and Isabella would finally accomplish in 1492 after the siege of Granada. When Granada falls, it was the last Moorish stronghold in Spain. And so what happens is, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile sort of create a more unified monarchy of Spain. They rule together as king and queen over Aragon and Castile, these two large regions of Spain. But of course, the thing is, it's like, even though militarily they have defeated the Muslims and driven them out of, Spain, that there are still a lot of people who are of Moorish descent and of Jewish descent who live in the Iberian Peninsula. And so this is a worry about the stability of the crown. That after going to all of this work in order to reconquer Spain and to bring it back under Christian control, there is worry that many of these people who had sort of nominally converted to Christianity so that they wouldn't be driven out, they were oftentimes given the choice of, it's like, well, you can convert and become Christian, or you can leave, and essentially be forced out of the country. So many would convert to Christianity, but they were then suspected oftentimes of really continuing to practice their old religion. Moranos were those who were known as Jewish converts, who were kind of suspect of continuing to follow Jewish practices, and the Moriscos were Muslim. The Moriscos were those who were of Moorish descent, hence the word. But the idea was that it's like, well, there was a lot of concern over whether or not their conversion was really genuine, because part of what Spain is seeking to do is they're seeking unity, and unity around the Catholic monarchs, around the monarchy, and around a state religion, which would be Catholicism. And so in 1478, the Pope grants the Spanish monarch's request to establish an Inquisition within Spain, to deal with this question of all of these people who are suspected of heresy, who are suspected of continuing to cling to Jewish and Muslim practices. And the person who is appointed Grand Inquisitor is the famous Tomás de Torquemada, who is the Queen's Dominican confessor and spiritual advisor. And so he begins his office as Grand Inquisitor in 1483. And again, the idea in the Spanish Inquisition, what we see is that it is largely a matter of politics. It is driven by political aims as much as it is really driven by any desire for sort of a purity of religion. So he is the Grand Inquisitor of Aragon and Castile from 1483 to 1498. So a 15-year period in which he served as Grand Inquisitor. Really effectively, his powers were curbed in 1494 because he had overstepped the mark. So it was even really a little bit shorter period than that. But he was the Grand Inquisitor. He's known for sort of his relentless persecution of these suspect Jewish and Muslim converts, again, largely driven too by political aims of unifying things under the crown and the Catholic religion. So in the end, he actually sort of gets himself into all kinds of trouble, even with Ferdinand and Isabella, largely because there was a lot of money flowing to the Spanish Inquisition. In order to run his network of tribunals, there was a lot of money that was being directed to this work of the persecution of Jewish and Muslim converts. Interestingly enough, his uncle Juan de Torquemada was somebody who defended the Jewish converts, and was very much against the idea of the persecution of these Jewish converts to Christianity. Torquemada perhaps was reacting to what was viewed as sort of his uncle's soft position on the issue, and was all the more rigorous for that. He also got himself in trouble with the Pope, because the Spanish Inquisition under Torquemada was so known for its excesses that even the Pope summoned him 3 times to to Rome to answer for various things that were happening within the Spanish Inquisition. So there's a great deal of concern during his reign as Grand Inquisitor, which is where so many of the black legends and myths about the Inquisition really come from. It was not unusual in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance for torture to be used in the extraction of confessions. It was not usually as severe, probably, as we normally think, but nevertheless, it was oftentimes there were limits to what kind of torture could be employed. But in this process of Inquisition, oftentimes the idea was like, okay, well, sometimes people need a little prompting to confess. That it's like okay, if they're not going to sort of confess their fault willingly, it's like we're going to just apply a little pressure literally in order to make that happen. Oftentimes, though, even in church law, there were limits to what could be done. There were also limits to what was considered to be acceptable testimony. Any kind of testimony acquired under any sort of enhanced interrogation techniques was going to be considered suspect. And so Torquemada, though, was sort of the most famous figure of the Inquisition, in particular the Spanish Inquisition. That what we see with this period in the Spanish Inquisition, though, it was, again, not something that was motivated simply by some sort of desire for the church to sort of pursue all of the heretics. It oftentimes was something that was joined together with political aims. That in an era when church and state were essentially unified and working together, it was not unusual for religion, as it was in many parts of Europe at the time. What we see with the growth of the Protestant Reformation is that religion was oftentimes a state matter. The people viewed it's like, well, the stability of society depended upon everybody basically believing and practicing the same thing. It was viewed as something that was a unifying cultural aspect. And then, of course, one of the aspects of the Spanish Inquisition, Lori? Historians these days have gone back and really sort of revised their opinion that most people would say that rather like probably a lot of Nazi bureaucrats during World War II, that he was simply very efficient at what he did, and was not overly concerned about the morality of, for instance, the use of torture or something, that essentially he had particular aims that he wanted to accomplish. Was religious zeal a part of it? No doubt, but he also was somebody who had a long history of working with the Spanish monarchs with a political aim in mind. Again, these things were simply not separate. I think in many ways it was his zeal, that got him that really got him into trouble. And it was the idea, because for the most part, during the Moorish occupation of Spain and Portugal, during that period in history, it was like, Jews had lived, under Muslim occupation, quite peacefully. There was a large Jewish population that existed within Spain. And likewise, there had been a large Moorish population, many of whom did not, they were generations removed from Morocco or places in North Africa from which they had come. Spain was essentially home to them, and they were determined to try and find a way to stay. But then, of course, as sort of the ethnic minorities, as the old Christian, as the Reconquest sort of reaches its conclusion, and Spain is once again under Christian control, there's the whole question of it. There's a real concern that these ethnic minorities are, talk about a tale as old as time. It was like, there was a concern that these ethnic minorities were going to undermine what the Reconquest was designed to achieve, which was a unified Catholic Spain under the monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. That as they are seeking to do this, there was really the concern was as much political as it was anything religious. But it's also politics and religion were so enmeshed in this period that they were oftentimes viewed as the same thing. That to persecute heretics was something that helped to protect the stability of society. It was something that helped underpin everything within society. That it's like well, no, being different was not a good thing. If you were striving to achieve some kind of unity, if you were trying to preserve social order, it was like they wanted a sameness. And the idea of ethnic minorities that would have other allegiances was something that that they were determined to sort of suppress, and going after people who were considered. And going after people who were considered to be, some sort of threat to the regime. And so the auto de fe was an important aspect that was particularly prominent in the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. The auto de fe, famously, as Mel Brooks says in History of the World Part 1, it's like what you oughtn't to do, but you do anyway. The auto de fe was sort of the giving of the verdict and usually these were large batches of people who had been accused of heresy. It was designed, it was after a whole bunch of people had sort of been investigated as part of the Inquisition. There was this huge public spectacle in which sentences would be pronounced upon those who had been subject to the Inquisition. They were oftentimes these huge, elaborately orchestrated public affairs. It was not so much about, it was really not, the purpose of the auto de fe was really not so much simply in order to, actually pass a verdict and pass a sentence. It was designed essentially to, it was designed as a form of, public spiritedness. It was meant to be a spectacle for the public to impress upon them that it's like, you don't want to be one of these people accused of heresy. But also it was something that, it was frequently a day-long affair. It would start with, there would be fasting and prayers. They would have an outdoor mass. They would have this parade through the streets with those who had been accused. An auto de fe. So this work of art here sort of depicts one of the later periods in 1680, one of the last huge auto de fes in the city of Madrid. This took place in the main plaza, the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, and there were a number, and that it was a huge sort of spectacle, but it served a very public purpose, which is why they sort of did it in such grand fashion. Despite what most people believe about the Inquisition, actual execution was relatively rare. Most people have the idea that it's like, yes, the church on flimsy pretexts would find people guilty of heresy and then burn them at the stake. That is not actually what happened most of the time in the Inquisition. Relatively few cases actually ended in execution. Imprisonment was much more, imprisonment, sometimes for lengthy periods, was very common. Public flogging, which at the time was also a very common punishment. There might be some kind of public penance that would have to be done. It was very common for there to be fines or the deprivation of goods. You would essentially, have your house, your goods taken away from you. But most of the sentences did not actually end in execution. Those were relatively rare because most of the time, the sentences that ended in execution were usually if somebody who had been found guilty of serious heresy. It was because if they were found guilty of heresy, it was because they were very vocally unrepentant, or that they were recalcitrant and insisted on persisting in their heresy. And so usually, the goal oftentimes of the inquisitorial process was not to have somebody sent, to be burned at the stake. The idea was really to sort of convince them to repent of their heresy and then do some sort of penance, face some kind of temporal punishment for what they had done. But essentially, it was meant to be a process of reconciling them back to the church. Recantation of heresy was really the aim. It was not to send people to the stake. mistake. And so very few sentences actually, and it was also not at all unusual for people to be exonerated. Oftentimes in the Inquisition, we oftentimes think of it as like, well, all you have to be is denounced and you're guilty. That was not the way that it worked. Part of the process in assembling the evidence, in the judge being able to inquire into the circumstances and assemble the facts of the case, it was not at all unusual for people to be exonerated of the charge of heresy and for a judge to say, there's nothing there. There's no real evidence, that would point to this person being some sort of heretic.
Given human nature and the size of the Inquisition, wasn't there corruption?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, there was a great deal of corruption, because again, interestingly enough, there was, there's oftentimes more of a problem even with sort of overzealous judges. You see like a Torquemada who was just overzealous in the way that he was going about the process. There could be corruption because again, the evidence that people would give, it's like they weren't overly concerned sometimes about, well, is this tainted evidence or is it not? They would be concerned about, it's like, okay, was this evidence obtained under torture, which is probably of less value than evidence that was voluntarily submitted? But do you have people who bear false witness, in order because they want to take over their formerly Jewish neighbor's store next door, and so they're going to accuse them of secretly still being a Jew and their conversion not being genuine? It's like, yes, you could have all kinds of abuses of the process that would occur, but in many ways it's like, was any other form of justice at the time free of corruption? I think we could look at the judicial system today and say there's corruption in the judicial system, in the way that one of the things that we see, I think, is that any kind of human justice is almost always going to be subject to flaw, simply because we're trying to know things that we're trying to assemble evidence, we're trying to make a just decision, but there are a lot of things that can interfere with that process of justice. There are a lot of things that can taint the process of justice. We oftentimes talk about the value of trial by jury, and yet, a friend of mine when I was in Stillwater, a parishioner there, she was, British, and she was a naturalized U.S. citizen, and she got put on a jury, and she said, well, it was a case, she said that the case that was being tried was, some local person who worked in oil exploration or something, some smaller company that was doing work for for a big oil company, and they were suing the big oil company, for some breach of contract or something like that. And she said, the jury was not really interested in the law. She said she was very disappointed in how the whole process worked because she said everybody was just against the big oil company because they were a big oil company, and they wanted to side with the local guy in the case. And she said they weren't interested in what the law had to say about whether there was really breach of contract here. They just wanted to go after the big oil company. And she said, I was so frustrated with the way the whole jury process worked because she said, I felt like we did not follow the law. We followed emotion, in terms of making a judgment in that case, and she was very disappointed with it. So I think corruption almost always exists within any kind of human justice system. One of the things about the inquisitorial process was really that it was trying to correct what was a far more easily abused kind of system, where a corrupt judge, who is simply arbitrating, a case, could be very, very subject to being bribed, to simply doing what his friends wanted him to do. That the Inquisition was in some ways an attempt to bring about a more fair and a more systematic process of justice. It looks severe to modern eyes, I think, when we look at the Inquisition today, but in some ways it was an improvement over other systems, other judicial processes that existed at the time, in which evidence had no part to play whatsoever. Nobody was really interested in the evidence. It was largely a question of, it's like, well, I like you and I don't like him, so I'm going to side with him, which was not a good system of justice really at all. Peggy?
Well, her mention of human foibles, I'm so struck
by the use or the overzealousness being hunger for power and fear being at the base of that power, because this is so public, it keeps everybody scared. And when they talk about public penance and deprivation and all that, how, I mean, if the person who's taken to an Inquisition to begin with because they doubted their conversion to Catholicism, how are they going to say, yeah, I'm really a Catholic, and be off? Because nobody trusts anybody in this kind of a setting.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was, it was part of the reason why there was really an investigative process, because again, part of the nature of the Inquisition was they did really want to have a decision and a verdict that was based on evidence. That there needed to be actual witnesses. They wouldn't even simply take, a person's, they wouldn't even simply take a person's confession of fault. That they required corroborating witnesses in order to, it couldn't simply be one person says you did this, and therefore you must be guilty. They always needed to find other corroborating witnesses. Again, is that subject to all kinds of human foibles? Yes. This is why there could be abuses, certainly within the process. But there are those human motivating factors, as well, that fit into sort of, oftentimes it was the overarching idea of trying to preserve and maintain a social order. And that was largely what the work of like the Spanish Inquisition was trying to do. It's like, well, how do we, in this unsettled time in Spanish history, after the Reconquest has been successful, how do we go about creating a new social order that will bring stability and prosperity, and how do we get everybody on the same page? These days we are much more comfortable with the idea of diversity in society. The way democracy works, yes, we have a very different approach to that understanding. In this period in history, though, the idea of diversity was not something to be encouraged. It's like, no, it's much better if everybody believes exactly the same thing, and therefore we are going to ensure that anybody who believes differently is being persecuted for it and being made to change their mind. The idea that people can live, that diversity can kind of exist, that somebody could be. We see the same sort of thing during the Protestant Reformation with Catholics in England. It's like, could a Catholic be faithful, to Queen Elizabeth I, who is Protestant? Does she have loyal Catholic subjects who, both are loyal subjects but also loyal to the Church in professing their Catholic faith? There were many for whom that was exactly the case, but generally the Crown viewed them as those who were perpetually a threat. That every Catholic was trying to get was trying to assassinate Elizabeth I. That was how many of her advisors viewed that situation in history. It's like Catholics in Protestant England were not to be trusted. They were all out to do evil, and they were all a Guy Fawkes, seeking to blow up Parliament or do whatever. That's something else that has persisted in history down to the present day. So oftentimes, again, it was a complex thing. What the aims really were. And we oftentimes have difficulty from where we sit today being able to put ourselves into that mindset. Within history of, well, why are they so insistent on rooting out anybody who's maybe not a really faithful Catholic? It's like, well, because if you were not a faithful Catholic, you were perceived as a threat to the regime. You were upsetting the social order. You were upsetting the aims that they were trying to achieve. And so it becomes something that is, it becomes something that can be very, very fraught. And in Spain, we sort of see this, in sort of its darkest incarnation, within history, largely because you had some of the most zealous, and there were many people who were subject. Teresa of Avila was subject to the Inquisition. Inquisition. Some of her writings were brought before her writings were brought before the Inquisition in Spain. But she was exonerated. They reviewed them and said there's no heresy here. It's all fine. And now she's a doctor of the church. So, but she was investigated by the Inquisition. Because it's like, okay, is what this this female nun writing about, is this in line with what the church teaches? The Inquisition examined her writings and in the end found that there's no problem there. But it was not unusual. Again, Inquisition, the Inquisitions oftentimes had like very, very broad powers to be able to investigate these things. And some of them were much more zealous than others. It's the zealous ones who have really kind of gone down in history as being particularly problematic. So what we see arising then from the Spanish Inquisition is, the Roman Inquisition in some ways comes about because of it had already existed, but it becomes much more powerful and acquires universal jurisdiction over the church, largely because of the abuses that were happening in places like Spain. In the Papal States, remembering that at this point in history, the Pope is the successor of St. Peter, but he is also a temporal monarch who governs territory, a great deal of Italy. And so in the Papal States, largely in central and northern Italy, the Roman Inquisition had sort of existed alongside all of the other regional tribunals throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The Pope also had the ability to appoint papal inquisitors who outranked the regional inquisitors, but did not outrank bishops or the appointees of bishops in judicial tribunals. And so papal inquisitors had sort of, again, part of the reason this is entrusted to the Dominicans and to a lesser extent the Franciscans was largely because of the fact that as a papal inquisitor, they could travel around. They could go wherever the Pope sent them, as opposed to local clergy or Benedictines or members of monastic orders, Cistercians or something. And so by the 16th century, and especially in light of the sort of explosion of the Protestant Reformation, where suddenly there's sort of, again, widespread heresy everywhere within the church sees the need to sort of rein in and systematize all of these national and regional tribunals. So one of the reforms of the Council of Trent in 1542 is the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which is instituted with universal jurisdiction in the church. So the idea that you can have a Spanish Inquisition, which is just doing its own thing over here, it's like, no, it has to answer to the Roman Inquisition. It has to answer to the Holy Office. And so we see, again, a centralization and a more systematic approach to the way that the Inquisitions work. And of course, the Roman Inquisition was nowhere near as harsh as things like the Spanish Inquisition. But what we see then, of course, is after the creation of the Holy Office, over the course of centuries, and particularly after the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, the growing separation of church and state means that there is a lot less collaboration between the two. The idea of Christendom, with the growth of nation states, the idea of Christendom, had kind of gone under. The work of the Holy Office largely is concerned with internal things, internal discipline within the church. It's concerned with dealing with theological issues and heresy. So the Holy Office sort of eventually becomes the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, one of the curial offices in the Vatican, and Pope Francis changed its name to the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. And so this was the office that Cardinal Ratzinger for many years headed. Gerhard Müller is another famous recent head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And so much of the work of the Dicastery today is really concerned with advising the Pope on theological issues and clarifying theological questions. It's like when the Pope writes an encyclical, people from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith actually review it and check the citations and actually make sure the Pope hasn't said anything he oughtn't to in an encyclical. However, the work of this Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, even today, it still may issue warnings on theological works. It can make determinations on heresy, which can result in excommunication. There Oftentimes there may be particular ministries within the church that then are sidelined by because they're not considered in keeping with Catholic theology, and so there is still this disciplinary body within the church, which is sort of the descendant of the Inquisition, of great historical fame. We still really have the Inquisition today in a slightly different, in a different and more modern form. That there is still the concern for how do we determine if something is heresy and if it is not. What do we do with somebody who, a Catholic theologian who is writing controversial things and arousing a great deal of concern with the things that they are saying? It's like, well, who evaluates that? Who investigates it? Who determines whether it is in line with church teaching or not? And so the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, sort of the descendant of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, is charged with making those determinations. However, really like the Inquisition, the modern day dicastery for the doctrine of the faith actually still has the same kind of aim, which is that we're looking to correct heresy. We are looking for, if we point out to some controversial writer, in Catholic theology that's like, what you're saying is not really in line with church teaching, and we're going to need you to backtrack on that. They may be stubborn and say no. It's like, what I have written, I have written, and that it's like, I believe it, I'm not changing a word of it. In which case, it's like, there may be further disciplinary action taken. However, formal excommunication is relatively rare in the church today. And again, it's usually reserved for those who, it's the worst punishment that can be meted out by the church, since, they don't necessarily imprison people or anything anymore, or burn them at the stake. So excommunication is about the worst thing that can happen, but it only happens at the end of a very long judicial process. We oftentimes, I think, don't necessarily think about like the judicial process and the way that the church actually has these internal judicial processes that work. But for instance, like anybody who has sort of been through like doing a petition for a declaration of nullity, a formal case within the church, it's a very inquisitorial process. And it's all done basically by testimony of witnesses. Like, what are the facts of the case? It's like, when did the alleged marriage take place? It's like, what were the circumstances around it? It's collecting depositions from witnesses, and then you have a tribunal of canon law trained judges who are going to render a verdict on it. That's kind of the way the Inquisition always worked. And we still have it really within the church today in terms of the way that our tribunal system works within the church. Which again has returned. There is sort of the office in Rome, which is the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And there are courts at a very high level within the Vatican. But most of it takes place, again, kind of back where it first started, which is on a diocesan level. Every diocese has a tribunal of canon law trained judges who oftentimes are asking questions in order to determine, it's like, is this in line with church teaching? Is it not? Is it, what exactly is fair, in terms of the administration of canon law? And so all of those questions, we do actually really sort of still see it in some ways today. Do you have a question, Susan?
Does this dicastery for the doctrine of faith, do they get involved in canonization research?
No, there is typically they might work with the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, which is another Vatican congregation. They may work with them if there are writings that need to be evaluated.
Do they get involved, like classic one we had at parish I was at, where everybody got all crazy? There was an image of Christ on the side of the church. And turned out it was a tree that was casting shadow, but in the meantime, all the pilgrims were coming.
Yes.
And
This is why thorough evidence gathering is always a good idea.
and so I'm thinking, would that be something, if somebody is really pushing that, would that be something that they would involve and say,
Yes, I mean, oftentimes, I mean, this is again an area where the modern day congregation, for the doctrine of the faith, the dicastery, would get involved. Is questions of like a Marian apparition. Very famously, Medjugorje is one that has been subject to all kinds of questions over the years because it's been going on since the 1980s and is supposedly still going on. And so the challenge there is, it's like, okay, well, as the church is trying to make a determination whether we should be encouraging people to go on pilgrimage there or not, it's like, okay, is this genuine? Is it fake? Is it, what is the content of the messages? There are other sort of visionaries, that this is something where like the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith would get involved to sort of evaluate. It's like, is there anything that is harmful, to the good of the faithful? Is this all sound theology? Is this all sound doctrine? Is this sound piety? Or is there something suspicious about this that we should be discouraging people from following this? They get involved in those kinds of questions and sometimes have to render a judgment about, it's like, okay, people need to be, we don't consider this to be authentic. People should be discouraged from making a pilgrimage to this place or believing that this is true. So they'd sometimes get involved in like private revelation or determining, but there is a dicastery for the causes of saints, which does most of the work when it comes to evaluating whether or not somebody is in their cause for canonization.
Or let's say United States, as opposed to always going to Rome?
It begins on the diocesan level. Yeah, so for instance, it's like Blessed Stanley Rother's cause started in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, because they had, technically it should have started in the diocese of, it should have started in the Diocese of Sololá in Guatemala, where Santiago Atitlan is located, because that's where he was martyred. However, they did not have they did not feel they had the resources to pursue the cause for his canonization in the Diocese of Sololá. And so the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City said, well, we are very interested in promoting his cause for canonization, and so we are willing to undertake this since he was a native of Oklahoma. We will undertake, and the diocese in Guatemala said, you go for it. The Congregation for Saints at the time said, that's perfectly fine by us. If the Diocese of Sololá wants to pass on heading up the cause, Oklahoma City can go ahead and undertake it. And so there was a whole process that then, and a lot of it in the causes of saints is gathering information about their life. It's like, okay, there's a whole sort of what's called a positio, sort of like, it's like, okay, there's a huge, immense amount of file that is put together, on this person to determine whether or not their cause should be advanced. But a lot of it happens on the diocesan level first. And since miracles are required for beatification and canonization in most cases, they have to investigate that at the diocesan level. And then typically a diocesan committee advances it to the Congregation for Saints in Rome to make that determination.
Just a real quick question, Father. As laity, how do we know whether what we're watching or reading is in line with church teaching?
Yes.
There's an imprimatur in books that should we only be reading books with an imprimatur?
Not necessarily. I mean, one of the things that used to be part of the remit of the Holy Office was the Index of Forbidden Books. The Index of Forbidden Books were largely books that were considered to be in some way out of line with church teaching and therefore not for the faithful to consume. However, it was entirely possible to get permission from your bishop to read something that was on the Index of Forbidden Books. And so the Index of Forbidden Books, which at some point must have been enormously large, but for instance, like St. Edith Stein had to get permission from her bishop because she worked in philosophy. There were a number of prescribed works that were on the index that she had to get permission from her bishop to let her read those in doing her own work in Catholic philosophy. And it was usually not a problem because, again, if in the bishop's estimation this person is not going to be corrupted by what they're reading, it was considered fine. But the Index of Forbidden Books, which doesn't really exist anymore, the Index of Forbidden Books was kind of meant to provide guidance to the faithful, like, avoid this author. It's like, that there are corrupting influences within it. We don't worry about that quite so much anymore these days. There are times I think maybe we should, but it's like, again, literature is so prolific now that I don't know where you would even begin to sort of like determine it's like, okay, this is safe for the faithful to read and this is not. When it comes to works of theology, I think it is always a good idea. It's oftentimes more useful when we are specifically looking at works of theology. It's like, does this have like a nihil obstat, which basically means it's like there's nothing objectionable in it, or an imprimatur, which means it's a bishop saying, let it be printed. That having an imprimatur, having a nihil obstat, is a good sign that it's like, okay, there's nothing objectionable. This is considered to be sound Catholic theology. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like, okay, well, that there aren't valuable things to read, which maybe nobody sought an imprimatur or a nihil obstat. So. Harry Potter might have ended up on the Index of Forbidden Books. It would not have surprised me at the time. For instance, it's like there were famous works of literature which landed on the Index of Forbidden Books. Like Victor Hugo was frequently not in favor with the Vatican. Pope Pius IX was not a fan of Victor Hugo. And sometimes, the things that could land you on the Index of Forbidden Books were really rather silly. That is kind of like, well, it was just being critical of something within the church or something that didn't make the church look good or something. It's part of the reason why the Index of Forbidden Books eventually went by the wayside, because some of the things could be very, very arbitrary. And so eventually they sort of did away with the idea of the Index of Forbidden Books, but we still have the custom of like the imprimatur or the nihil obstat when it comes to works of theology in order to be able to determine those things. So, just to sort of wrap up, some of the things to sort of take away, I think, from the understanding of the Inquisition, that while it was certainly subject to abuses in the way that it oftentimes obtained evidence, it really was an improvement on a lot of the other forms of judicial trials within its day, which is why it is still in secular use in many countries today. The inquisitorial process is actually still utilized in many countries that follow Roman law. For instance, in France, in Spain, if there in France, like judges are essentially like prosecutors. They are looking to assemble the evidence and determine whether there is enough evidence to charge somebody with a crime. That it's an inquisitorial process. It's evidence gathering, and judges have a great deal of power to sort of compel the production of evidence, or to compel somebody to give witness in a particular case. And so we actually still see sort of the inquisitorial process as a basis even for civil law in many countries today, where their civil law, it follows sort of Roman law as opposed to the Germanic tradition. Now, we also see that the Inquisition had a lot of different forms. The Spanish Inquisition was only one of many kinds of the Inquisition that existed in various times and places, and it was really by no means bloodthirsty. Heresy was again viewed as something that was a real threat to the stability of society, but repentance was usually the desired outcome. In most cases, again, only the recalcitrant and the very vocally unrepentant would be subject to execution or to some sort of severe punishment. And ultimately, I think the big takeaway is the idea that justice ascertained and executed by human beings is always going to be flawed, because we do not have God's omniscience and we frequently do not have his mercy. And therefore, really, whatever kinds of judicial processes exist, they are always flawed, because we are trying as human beings, with our limited knowledge, with our limited ability to sometimes be able to get at the truth, that we are oftentimes, very limited then when it comes. We can't live in a society that does not have justice. We can't live in a society in which there are not judicial processes that try to determine guilt or innocence. That the idea that we need to have some sort of justice system. But as human beings, it is always going to be flawed because there are miscarriages of justice, and whether that is a miscarriage of justice that occurs because of the Inquisition, or whether a jury makes the wrong verdict, that the jury reaches a wrong verdict. It's like every system of human justice is going to have its flaws. The Inquisition certainly had its flaws. Overzealous, prosecutors, judges who were determined to, root out heresy, who were driven oftentimes by political aims, who themselves could even be corrupted by bribes or by other things that were completely unconcerned with the aims of justice. All of these things, I think one of the things that we do take away is the sense that, as the church in her own judicial system, in her own judicial processes, was trying to make determinations about guilt or innocence, did they get it wrong? No doubt. Sometimes they probably also were getting it right. They were really seeking to employ a system of justice which was fair in order to get at the truth. And that is something that every judicial process, I think, struggles with. That as human beings, we do not always get it right when we are having to sit in judgment on our neighbor, when we are having to determine whether they are guilty or innocent. There are even the questions of, it's like, well, what are they guilty or innocent of? That it's like some things, that we would not consider to be crimes today were very much crimes in the Middle Ages. Again, heresy was something that we are not all that concerned about except internally within the church today, but that was a big deal, in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. Something that, again, could be seen as something that was, causing the unraveling of society if you permitted heretics to spread their heresy, that you needed to put a stop to it. And that was in many ways sort of the origin of the Inquisition. And we see, though, how it has the church's process, the church's judicial process, has changed, as it has come down to the modern day. But one of the things I found most interesting was the fact that the Inquisition was not this narrow period in history, but that actually it's a huge, broad span of 1,000 years within church history in terms of how does the church go about carrying out a judicial process. How do we go about determining truth? Susan?
Two things. One, do you have a potential bibliography for us on this? And secondly, who brought charges? Who instigated the process?
One of the things about the Inquisition was the idea that one of the ideas about the Inquisition was that it usually could not be just one person who denounced somebody and brought a charge. It usually needed to be something that was publicly perceived, that there was a broad public perception that this person was widely suspected, that was usually the basis for bringing a case. Because again, it had to be supported by multiple witnesses and not just one person. Yeah, and heresy was, yes. Yeah, and a lot of times heresy was properly tried in an ecclesiastical court, but heresy was also, in a sense, a civil crime. And so the punishment was oftentimes carried out by the civil authorities because if you were a heretic, you were probably also violating secular law at the time. And so the church was the one who properly could determine whether you were a heretic. And if you were a heretic, then you were probably also guilty of violating a bunch of civil laws as well. So again, for much of the history, it's like the church and the state were really sort of working together because there was a great deal of overlap in terms of their interests and even the way that the process worked. And so it can get very complicated, and we see a lot of differentiation based on where an Inquisition, where an ecclesiastical court was at work. Nowadays it's like they tend to work very separately. Although there are still things that are involved in, for instance, it's like looking at an annulment petition within the church. It's like the church will not even begin that process until a civil divorce has already been granted. It's like, we don't operate that separately, from, simply because it's like, well, we're not interested in getting crosswise and existing within a bubble, either. So Very good. Well, I know we are coming up on Mass, so, but thank you. Yeah, thank you all. We'll let you know when our next deep dive into history is. If anybody has suggestions on things they'd love to know about, just let me know.
Our next history deep dive is March 1st and March 8th. So Dr. Bob Scott, who's a parishioner, is going to do March 1st on the face of Jesus. And on March 8th, my favorite church historian, is going to teach again on the relics of the Passion. My favorite Catholic historian. Now, one of my favorite local theologians recently said to me, "The Mass is everything." That would be a Father Vince Fernandez quote. And if you are seeking to go deeper in your relationship with God next year, Father Vince is going to offer 6 consecutive Sunday sessions on the Mass, beginning January 11th. So January 11th for 6 Sundays, the Mass. And if you haven't been yet, hustle over. What, Carol?